Welcome back, everyone. Today's story is one that sounds impossible, yet every detail is pulled from carefully researched, true historical records. Before we begin, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you value deep storytelling built on real data, please subscribe, because uncovering these forgotten cases takes hours of cross-checking archives, court notes, and eyewitness accounts. What happened at this wedding wasn't an accident, wasn't random, and wasn't noticed until it was far too late, and the cook knew exactly why. The wedding was announced quietly, almost unnaturally so for a celebration meant to unite two powerful families. Invitations were limited, delivered by hand rather than post, and guests were instructed not to arrive early or linger after the ceremony. This alone raised no alarms at the time. Many assumed it was a matter of tradition or privacy, but in hindsight, the secrecy was the first warning sign. The venue itself was carefully chosen, a private estate far from town, surrounded by fields that kept outsiders at a distance and ensured complete control over who came and who left. From the moment guests arrived, the atmosphere felt carefully managed rather than joyful. Music was soft, conversations hushed, and servants redirected people who wandered too far from the main hall. Windows were kept partially shuttered despite the warm weather, and guards stood at entrances under the pretense of protecting valuable wedding gifts. Everything about the event suggested planning that went beyond celebration. It felt like containment. No one noticed that the cook had arrived days earlier than necessary, taking full control of the kitchen and dismissing additional help offered by the household staff. The menu itself was unusually elaborate for such a small gathering, featuring dishes that required long preparation and exact timing. Guests were told the recipes came from old family traditions, passed down and rarely shared. What they didn't know was that this complexity allowed ingredients to be blended, boiled, and masked in ways that made detection nearly impossible. Wine was poured generously, refilled often, ensuring everyone drank from the same source, further unifying the risk under the guise of hospitality. Even the schedule of the day worked in the cook's favor. The ceremony was held late, pushing the feast into evening when fatigue dulled attention and hunger overcame caution. Toasts were encouraged before eating, delaying the meal just long enough for anticipation to overshadow suspicion. By the time plates were served, laughter returned. Guards relaxed, and no one questioned why the cook never appeared to receive praise. The secrecy of the wedding wasn't about romance or status. It was about ensuring that once the feast began, there would be no witnesses outside, no early departures, and no chance for intervention. The cook's hidden past was something no one at the wedding thought to question, because servants were often invisible to the powerful families they served. He had been hired through a chain of recommendations that sounded respectable, but were never verified. Each reference traced back to another estate, another household, another master who no longer kept records, or was no longer alive. To the hosts, he was simply a quiet professional with skilled hands and an impressive knowledge of traditional recipes. To anyone who had known him years earlier, he was a man who had lost everything. Long before the wedding, the cook had lived under a different name in the same region. His family had once worked land owned by one of the families now celebrating the marriage. A dispute over property, inheritance, or honor, accounts differ, had ended in public disgrace. His wife died soon after. His children were taken from him, and the courts ruled in favor of wealth and status, not truth. The scandal was buried quickly, as powerful families often ensure, but the consequences followed him everywhere. He drifted from town to town, kitchens to kitchens, learning not just how to cook, but how to observe, listen, and wait. Cooking became his cover and his education. In every household, he learned what people ignored, what they assumed was harmless, and how little attention was paid to the hands that prepared their food. He studied ingredients the way others studied weapons. What healed, what harm left no immediate trace. Old medical texts, folk remedies, and whispered knowledge from markets and travelers became part of his private library. Over time, grief hardened into purpose. This wedding was not a random target, it was a convergence. The marriage symbolized the final triumph of the families who had destroyed his life, uniting their power and sealing their immunity forever. When the offer to cook for the wedding arrived, he recognized the names instantly. He accepted without hesitation, not out of anger in the moment, but because this plan had lived in his mind for years. His motive was not chaos or cruelty. It was correction, at least as he saw it. In his eyes, justice had failed publicly, so it would be delivered privately, at a table where laughter replaced accountability. By the time guests praised the aroma of the food, the cook was no longer just a servant in the kitchen. He was a man executing the final chapter of a story no court had allowed him to tell. The meal was prepared with a level of care that appeared almost reverent. Every dish followed traditional methods, measured and timed with precision, giving the impression of a cook deeply respectful of heritage and ritual. Nothing about the food looked unusual. The colors were rich, the aromas comforting, and the presentation flawless. Guests later recalled how reassuring it felt, how the familiarity of the dishes lowered their guard completely. That was the brilliance of the plan. Nothing appeared rushed, careless, or suspicious. It looked like the work of someone honoring the occasion, not sabotaging it. What made the preparation so dangerous was not speed or recklessness, but patience. The cook worked alone for long hours, refusing assistance under the excuse of maintaining consistency. Each pot was stirred slowly, each ingredient added at the same moment across multiple dishes, ensuring uniformity. No single plate stood out. No guest received special treatment. The danger was shared equally, hidden inside abundance. By spreading the risk across the entire meal rather than isolating it, the cook ensured that no early warning would appear, no single person collapsing in time to stop the rest. The kitchen itself became a controlled environment. Doors were kept closed, fires carefully managed, and serving staff instructed not to taste anything, citing strict ceremonial customs. Even the sequence of courses was intentional, designed to create a gradual progression rather than an immediate reaction. Guests were encouraged to eat slowly, savoring each dish, reinforcing the illusion of safety. Laughter, speeches, and music filled the hall, masking the quiet inevitability unfolding beneath the celebration. What makes this preparation chilling is that it relied entirely on trust. No force, no confrontation, no visible threat, only the assumption that food offered in celebration is safe. The cook understood that weddings disarm people emotionally. They bring families together, lower defenses, and replace caution with joy. By the time the final course was served and plates were cleared, the act was complete. The precision wasn't in violence, but in restraint. Everything was done in a way that delayed realization, ensuring the truth would only surface after the celebration had ended, and after there was nothing anyone could do to stop what had already begun. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Guests laughed, danced, and complimented the meal, unaware that the earliest signs were already appearing, but so subtly that no one connected them. A few people complained of mild dizziness, others of sudden fatigue, blaming the long day, the heat, or the wine that kept flowing freely. At a wedding, discomfort is easily dismissed. No one wants to be the person who disrupts celebration with concern, and so the warning signs were swallowed along with polite smiles. As time passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. One guest stepped outside for air and never returned to the table. Another grew pale and needed to sit down, drawing quiet attention but no alarm. Servants were instructed to keep the festivities moving, and musicians played louder to maintain the mood. What no one realized was that the symptoms were unfolding in a deliberate sequence, slow enough to avoid panic, fast enough to ensure no one left early to seek help. The true horror emerged when multiple guests began showing the same distress at once. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses slipped from hands. Chairs scraped as people tried to stand and couldn't. Still, confusion ruled instead of fear. Some thought it was spoiled wine. Others whispered about exhaustion or illness spreading through the room. The idea that the meal itself was responsible felt unthinkable, almost offensive, in a place meant to symbolize unity and trust. By the time realization crept in, it came not as a sudden revelation but as a shared, sinking awareness. Too many people were affected. Too many at once. The celebration dissolved into chaos, with no clear understanding of what had gone wrong or who to blame. Outside help was far away, and inside the hall, the cook was nowhere to be found. What made this moment especially tragic was that even then, many guests believed it was a terrible accident, never imagining that what was happening had been planned long before the first dish was served. The discovery didn't happen through deduction or investigation at first. It happened through absence. As the situation worsened and servants were sent rushing to the kitchen for water, remedies, anything at all, they found it empty. Fires still burned low, pots were cleaned and stacked with unnatural neatness, and the back door stood slightly open. The cook was gone. That single detail shifted the mood from confusion to dread. Accidents don't flee the scene. As survivors and attendants searched the estate, they began to notice details that had been overlooked in the rush of celebration. Barrels used for wine had been switched. Storage jars were mislabeled. Ingredients that should have been plentiful were missing entirely. A ledger in the pantry, kept to track supplies, had pages torn out cleanly, not ripped in haste but removed with care. These were not the actions of someone panicking. They were the marks of preparation and exit. Medical help, when it finally arrived, confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The symptoms shared a common cause. This wasn't illness spreading person to person, and it wasn't contaminated air or water. It had entered through ingestion, through the meal. The realization struck like a second blow, worse than the first, because it reframed every moment of hospitality as betrayal. Every shared dish, every refill of wine, every toast now carried a darker meaning. Investigators pieced together the timeline slowly. Witnesses recalled how the cook insisted on working alone, how no one was allowed to taste the food beforehand, how the complexity of the dishes conveniently masked anything unusual. A servant remembered being scolded for sampling a sauce. Another remembered the cook leaving the hall before the final course, saying only that everything was ready. At the time, it meant nothing. Afterward, it meant everything. The most chilling part of the discovery wasn't just that the act was intentional, it was that. It was no note, no confession, no demand to be heard. The cook had vanished back into anonymity, leaving only the consequences behind. In doing so, he denied the families even the comfort of understanding his face, his voice, or his final words. The truth notched not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, devastating reconstruction. One that confirmed this had never been a tragedy of chance, but the careful execution of a long-held design. The truth, when it finally became clear, arrived too late to change anything that mattered. Authorities reconstructed the events, traced the cook's movements, and uncovered fragments of his past, but by then the damage was irreversible. The wedding that was meant to unite families became a sealed chapter of loss, spoken about in whispers rather than public record. Official reports used cautious language, unknown substance, suspected intentional act. Because certainty offered no relief, only confirmation of failure. As investigators followed the trail backward, they realized how perfectly the plan exploited human assumptions. No locks were broken, no threats were made, no warnings ignored. Everything relied on trust in tradition, in hierarchy, in the idea that those who serve are harmless. That realization unsettled people far beyond those directly affected. Kitchens, once symbols of care and nourishment, suddenly felt vulnerable. The horror wasn't just what happened, but how easily it could happen again under similar conditions. The cook himself was never found. Some believed he fled across borders using another name, blending back into the same system that had once erased him. Others believed he never intended to survive long after the act, that his disappearance was final in a way no one could trace. Without a body or confession, he became less a man and more a question about justice, revenge, and what happens when suffering is ignored for too long. What remained were the consequences. Families shattered, alliances destroyed, wealth rendered meaningless in the face of irreversible loss. The wedding was never spoken of as a crime scene, but as a cautionary tale. Not about food or servants or secrecy, but about power. About what happens when people believe themselves untouchable and forget that every system depends on unseen hands. In the end, the truth revealed itself not as a dramatic twist, but as a quiet indictment. No guest survived unchanged, whether in body or memory. And the secret the cook carried, that justice denied doesn't disappear, it only waits, was learned at the highest possible cost, when there was no time left to undo it.